Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So with us today is Priya Jindal, and she'll be talking to us about evacuation expectations. Priya is the founder of NextPat. So Priya, can you tell us what NextPat is actually about?
Yeah, so NextPat is a platform I created about a year ago, or restarted a year ago. When I came back from one of my overseas trips, I realized that I really struggled with coming back and sort of figuring out where I was. So NextPat supports people coming home, whatever that means with that journey. So sometimes it could be as simple as figuring out what's next, but sometimes it's a lot larger, figuring out whether or not how you've changed and what that means for coming to a familiar place.
Okay, and so part of that process, obviously, you've been working a lot with people since the pandemic has happened, which is why we're having this talk today.
Exactly.
What to expect when you have an evacuation. And I suppose that's for the people that are leaving and arriving at the same time, right?
Yeah, so we talk about with both parties because I think being left behind, even if it's by choice, can feel pretty isolating, as can returning to a place where no one really knows, and especially in this crisis, is already dealing with their own situation back home. So I think it's a particularly unique situation, but evacuations are always really trying on both parties. So I do work with both parties, especially if people are planning to return to the place that they left.
And have you also been helping people that are separated from their partner or children because of this pandemic? So you're not optional.
Yeah.
Obviously, like they got stuck in different countries and they just cannot connect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually haven't had anyone come to me with that yet, which is sort of interesting. I think maybe people still think it's going to be a shorter term thing.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Did you hear what I just asked? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we do have people who, of course, have been trapped, right? Either they couldn't leave for some reason and their families left for security, or they were separated, like you said. There were a lot of people due to Chinese New Year who were traveling in different places, got trapped or tried to get to another airport, et cetera. So that's certainly been challenging for companies, families, et cetera. So a lot of that ends up being sort of how do you maintain that tie and reconcile when you are back together, which is certainly a challenge. We see that a lot, even beyond this crisis with war zone deployments and things like that.
Okay, because I know there's a few people in the group that have been facing that issue where they haven't seen, for example, their partners for 6 weeks now, not sure when they're going to get back together. So I know it must be a very difficult time for people experiencing that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's super challenging. I'd be really interested to see what they've been doing. I think we are lucky to live in a technological age and have a sense of being able to see people via FaceTime, et cetera. But it's not the same as maintaining, growing together. You're sort of growing independently and then come together and have to find a new normal, which is really challenging in a time where the entire world is going to be changed. And we don't really know what that's going to look like. So I'd love to hear what people have been doing to maintain that tie or to build that relationship, especially given how separated everybody is right now.
Okay, so if anybody wants to answer that question, go ahead and leave a comment and we will read it out.
Yeah.
So we really want this to be an interactive discussion with everyone. We were actually going to originally do this on Zoom, but we thought that now we have the StreamYard and that we're able to do this directly on the group, we'll give it a go and hopefully engage with everybody at the same time, which would be great.
Absolutely. So what I wanted to do first also was ask, I have a little screen, if you can share that, Naveen, that sort of bins out the different places you could be in your stage of evacuation, as well as whether or not you're leaving or departing or staying. If anyone is in this situation, I'd love to hear at what stage you are. I know, Naveen, you and I talked about sort of being in evacuation, post-evacuation mode while you were staying and people were leaving. So that's certainly a challenge. I don't know if anyone else is in a position.
I'm sure there are so many now. I mean, like it's just such a situation where you just don't know what's going to happen next. Who's leaving? Who's staying? Because overnight people are losing their jobs, right?
Yeah.
And they have to leave. They just don't have the choice. So
right. So did you, I know you had to deal with some of the situation as well. Did you have friends that left, and were you able to say goodbye, especially with isolation, which I think is what's particularly challenging about this situation? Anyone in the repatriation space talks a lot about saying farewell in a really holistic way.
Yes, so very recently, actually, I had a very good friend that she had to leave, and we were unable to see each other before she did. So yeah, that left like I suppose a gap that kind of, there wasn't that closure, I suppose, because it was especially that she left, and I don't know when I will ever see her again because she's gone back home.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a few things that raises, and I want to talk a little bit about closure and finding that when you may not be able to do it in person, which is how so many of us do these things. I was on another group the other day, and they said, what did you used to do to communicate with people, right? So 10, 15 years ago, before all of this proliferation of technology, what would we do? And I was just writing, and I said, I used to buy calling cards and go to a public call office and call my parents when I was overseas, because that was the only way to communicate. So we just weren't as connected. And my mother actually is the one who introduced me to WhatsApp, because it didn't exist when I went overseas. Right. So I think, though, with closure, which is really challenging for both parties, one of the things that can be really helpful is just a phone call. I think sometimes I think video can almost be distracting. Like we're like, oh, I'll just put it on in the back and do something else, the way we do with TV. And on a phone, especially if you don't have your earbuds in, but you're actually holding the phone, you really just have to sort of key in, because you can't do anything with your hands. And so you're focused to really think about the person you're speaking with. But the other thing is writing letters. I talk a lot about writing letters and everything. I think it's great from a gratitude perspective, and that's a wonderful resiliency practice. But writing out a letter also allows you to express a lot more. For some people would prefer the call, and that's fine. But for some people, writing it out helps them express themselves better. And it leaves you something tangible in the way that like a party or something that you do in person would help with. The other thing is that I've seen some really interesting and fun, innovative things that people are doing. And I'd love to hear if anyone has had to do this within the group, what they've been doing. There's been a lot of interesting, like not just virtual parties, but like postcards. So you could all write postcards to somebody and send them from the place. That way they get sort of this farewell, but over time, and they can keep it as a keepsake. The other thing, if you are the person leaving, that I talk a lot about is figuring out what you're going to miss and capturing that. This is really difficult in an evacuation situation because it's usually quite sudden. But if you have a few items that are precious for whatever reason, I find those experiences or things in some cases can be very useful to take before you go. So if you have time to plan before you leave, you might be like, I'm going to go to my favorite restaurants. Obviously not the case right now. Right. But you might have a favorite food and you can't get that spice back home. So maybe you're going to be like, I'm going to get that before I go. Those sorts of things really help you find that closure and integrate it into your life back home so that it's more holistic when you return. I also caution people from expecting to return. I think evacuation, like you were just saying, is often so much longer than we anticipate. And most people think it's going to be very short, and it just never is. It always ends up being quite some time because it takes a while for crises to resolve. So I think that planning to know that it's going to take some time certainly helps you be in the right mindset for it. It also allows you to say goodbye and have that closure so that the return is easy, right? Returning, no one is like, I'm really worried I'm going to have to get back in touch with this person. Right. So you can easily have the closure and feel like you can move on while continuing, while leaving the door open for somebody to come back in.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's very important you have your mindset in the right place when that does happen. I mean, like, it's a very emotional process as it is. And I suppose, like you rightly said, if you have that expectation of return and it doesn't happen, that's just going to lead you down another road that you don't want to be in.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's a really challenging place. I will say, for some context, I am a military brat. So I grew up overseas, and I moved every few years, moved back to the US. My dad got out, and I was really excited because I was putting down roots. I had good friends. I was in one place, and my best friend moved away. And I was just like, all right, that's how the world works. People just leave. You shouldn't have real friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I carried this with me for years and years and years. This happened when I was, I don't know, 14, maybe 15. And I carried this well into my 20s, mid 20s. And I did a course with a very good friend of mine now. And he said something. We were both going to our first tours overseas. And he said something about, well, we'll be in touch. And I was like, well, we won't be. And that's okay. And he was just like, are you insane? This person is basically like a brother to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, no, that's just what happens. And he said, well, maybe that's what happened, but that isn't what has to happen now. And I think that technology really does help us keep a lot of those relationships warm. But I really liked what you said regarding all of the feelings that come up. And what I sort of wanted to ask people was, how are you feeling? Where are you, depending on what stage you're in, in the journey? There's all of these feelings. I think somebody just mentioned people show their emotions in different manners in different ways. And there's all these different pieces and stages of this journey. And so, you get back and you're really excited. You're back home and you've got all these things that you've been missing. But I think there's also, clearly sadness for that loss. And so I'd love to hear, Naveen, sort of where you are, or anybody else who's watching, where they are with their journey and processing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, people have to allow themselves time to grieve, right? It's such a hard situation to be in. I had another friend actually that did go through this quite recently as well. Unexpectedly, they had to go back home as well, and it's very tough, to accept that, especially when you don't want to leave,
Right.
So I think, like we see here, Mary, you just read the first part, but she continues to say, people show their emotions in different manners, in different ways. This time is a time where we step out of our norm, because we are simply forced to, and find a resort, a place where we can still express and feel, yet adapt. Whatever way it is, set a mindset of appreciating what has been and embracing what is coming, even if it's different.
Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely. And I think it's all about mindset at the end of the day, finding the strength. I suppose it does require strength to put your mindset in the right place, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. We talk a lot about mindset, and I think I want to pause though before getting there, because I think sometimes we don't give ourselves the space to acknowledge the grief and sadness, and there's no way for us to metabolize that and process it without giving ourselves the permission to do so. And so often I see this like, okay, well, how do we move on? And I think it's certainly important to adapt and move on. And everybody here, that we're all, expats, they've done it. You've moved to a new place and found your community and your space within that place. So we're certainly available to do that. I talk a lot about mindset though, because when we move to a new place, we're really excited. We're excited about the new people we're going to meet, the new foods we're going to try, the new places we're going to be, some travel. But when we come home, we sort of have this nostalgia, and we have this image of our home trapped at this time that we left it. And we forget that when we approach it with that mindset, we aren't approaching it with this mindset that she's talking about, with appreciating what has happened and embracing what's about to come, because it's going to be different. And I think especially when we don't have the ownership over the decision to go home or to go to another safe place, we sort of, depending on culture, you don't have the control, and that there's an agency issue there, which really is challenging when you're saying, okay, I want to own the direction of my future. And so how do we do that in a way that allows us to move on and grieve? And I think having closure and grieving is a big part of owning where your emotions are, so that we can move on and adapt to whatever is new. I do really like that. It's a good point.
Absolutely. So how do you recommend people start dealing with those emotions? facing those, especially if you're someone like me, I usually suppress my emotions and I don't deal with it until much later, which is not always the best way to approach, certain situations.
Yeah. So I think saying goodbye actually is a really big part of this. And that can be through multiple different ways, right? It might be that you call somebody up, it might be writing a letter, but it could be making a keepsake book for yourself, right? Or writing your memories somewhere private where it's sort of contained for you. It doesn't have to be shared. All of those things help us start to reflect in a way that we're thinking about what we were fond of. And I think that's a really big part of understanding our loss and celebrating it in many ways. I also think that reflecting on those memories with things like pictures or connecting with people. So obviously with Facebook, that's a little bit easier. We can engage with people and remind ourselves of our connections. But I also believe that a lot of this comes down to self-care and giving ourselves space. So it might mean, taking a moment where it's possible. I know there's a lot of challenges with this because of families and situations that people are in. They may not be in their homes, they may be in hotels, etc. But if you can take space to do something that allows your mind to relax, so you're not focused on your priorities, you're allowing it to sort of I always use the word percolate, but think through things and let neural connections happen on their own. That starts to allow your brain itself to resolve some of these issues. It's also usually a situation where you're giving yourself some care. And I think for many of us, that signal to our brain and our body is really critical. So for me, this is cooking, right? I chop up vegetables, and that's very meditative to me because I can't really think of anything else. I would slice off a finger if I did. But I don't have to think about anything specific either. And so it allows me to start saying, okay, it's also something that you have agency over. So again, it goes back to this, what can I control?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I do like that. I think, you're very right. I'm like, it's a good technique to try.
Yeah, I think a lot of self-care goes a long way. So this could be other things too, right? Exercise, making sure you get enough sleep. I know that's really hard right now, but sleep is just so critical for so much of the thing, so much of our life, right? Like we can't be present, we can't be mindful when we aren't sleeping. So it's really critical part of this. The other thing that I think is really important is to be able to keep a pulse on what's happening in both places. So if you've left, to stay in touch with the people who are back there, but also recognize that life wherever you were has changed. And it's really easy to forget that in both situations. And that might mean things like sharing really mundane things happening in your life. So one of the things I really like for remote teams is sharing a picture outside your window. So we have teams in China, and China's a very, very big, busy place. And then, this crisis hits and there's no one on the roads. It's a really stark reminder that something is different. And I think sometimes the visual can help us realize that I'm not going to go back to the place that it was, which is really important. This goes back to the mindset. So leaving, you want to have this like adventure mindset of going home. Coming back is the same. It is a new place, like anywhere. So just in the same ways that we will all walk out of this with our own scars, places hold some of that too. And we don't think of places as having scars, but they are built and shaped by what the people bring to it. And in this time, we've all sort of left, and it's the same idea.
Absolutely. I think it's great. So you have here on the screen, it says, how are you feeling?
Yes.
So if anybody wants to share how they're feeling right now, I can tell you that I have a mixture of feelings myself, looking at the 6 options there. I wouldn't say, I'd say there's some sadness, definitely. Sadness and feeling inside out, for sure. I go between those two.
Yeah.
More than anything else. There's an element of joy, even though it's a very difficult situation and it's very sad what's happening to a lot of the people around the world. But there are elements of joy of bringing the family together, being able to reconnect and reprioritize, things in your life that we could not have done otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of my suggestions had actually been to sort of focus on some of that and the gratitude for it. So gratitude's really interesting because it allows us to really think in new and different ways, and it allows us to refocus our thoughts. So I just saw that somebody wrote, and I haven't, so Mary's talking about sharing other people's perspectives and experiences. But I also think that this is a great time to do the things that you don't get a chance to do, which is really critical. So I have 100 recipes. I always go back to cooking because that's where I spend all of my happy time, in the kitchen, and that I've wanted to try and I just never have time for, or I don't have, the bandwidth when I get home for. And it's been really nice to have that time to spend. I do think this feeling of sadness and inside out is really interesting. And I like what Mary wrote regarding sharing these feelings with someone you trust. That can be really great, even if it's to yourself. One of the things I have found over time works for many people is this practice and compassion of just being present. I think we sometimes forget the power, obviously, of touch, but even just being there for somebody. So sometimes it's not about asking how somebody's doing, but just asking them, just telling them that you're there. So when somebody is grieving, having somebody come over and just sit with you and not talk can often be enough, because it sends that signal, right, that someone's got your back. And I think that's so critical in this time when a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. I can move to the next slide too, if you'd like. So this one is a little bit different. And we're talking about the priorities. I think when we are moving or leaving a place, we can become really focused on what has to get done, right? So packing up, what items need to come with us, how do we get the kids or pets or anyone else out? And I think these questions are really important. So there's what you need to do and what you wish you could do. And I think sometimes we allow the needs to take over without thinking through why we're prioritizing those things, right? So we may be like, I really have to pack these clothes. But if you're getting a relocation amount for the situation, you probably do need to pack some clothes. But if it's taking away from something else that is actually more important to you, maybe it's better just arrive and buy clothes or borrow clothes, right? And I think that sometimes we don't even think through that because we're so focused on the logistical planning of getting moved. Go ahead.
No, so I was going to say I completely agree with you, and I think under the current circumstances as well, the forced evacuations or the repatriations is like my friend that just left recently. She felt that she was cheated on time. She lost the time that she wanted to actually spend doing certain things here before she left that she could not do because of the restrictions that were put in place. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of sort of how she dealt with that or what she reconciled with that?
To be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure. Under the current circumstances, there's not much we could do.
Right.
You just had to stay home and just get through your days and just, wait to see what's going to happen tomorrow.
Right.
But, I actually don't know how she actually emotionally dealt with that.
So I think one of the cool things right now is I feel this way when, relics get destroyed and stuff too, where you're like, but I didn't have a chance to go see that. And there's all of this really interesting work being done right now to allow people to explore different parts of the world online. So you can go to the Great Wall of China and like climb up the ruins and up the stairs and everywhere while being at home. And it's certainly not the same as being awestruck in the presence of some of the really amazing things in the world. But at least gives you a taste of it. And either that can help you say, okay, well, I've done something, or you can start planning, right, for like what's next and how am I going to achieve some of these or recreate some of these experiences. And for some people, I think planning can be for some people, planning in and of itself is more exciting than the experience. But for many others, right, it gets us to be very excited about the experience because we start to look forward to it and do research. There's some good science behind that as well. And so for some people, that may be an option if they can return. Obviously, in some cases, that's simply not possible. And I think that's very challenging. I think that just does take some grieving and some time to process it, or a corollary, which is something I have done actually in the past. I'd really, really wanted to go to Timbuktu in Mali. And when I was there, the entire time we weren't allowed. And so why did I want to go? It was mostly to see these big, giant mud mosques and other houses and stuff. The largest mud mosque in the world is in Jenne, which was open. And so that's what we did instead. And so there's sort of like a balance of can I experience something that allows me to feel some way without necessarily doing the thing that I had in my mind. So usually we're seeking the experience, not necessarily the specific place. And sometimes it's people, and that is a lot harder to replicate once you've left.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so from priorities, where do you go to next?
So I think understanding the priorities helps you to figure out where you want to spend time. So in this case, right, she felt like she didn't have enough time. And when you take that moment to step back and say, what do I need versus what do I wish I had time for? You may say, oh, I need to make different decisions then. Because my needs can actually be met in a different way. Or I wish I had time or energy for this, but I don't. And then it's a decision, right? It's no longer like a loss because you're now owning that decision from earlier on to say, I'm not going to be doing this specific thing. And then what's guiding it, I think, is really critical because it helps you see the patterns you have, which might help even when you get home. I don't think there's any other slides actually, though. So we can, oh, there we go. Yeah. So I think that the point of figuring out the priorities is to understand where you are and where you want to be going. So in this case, if somebody wants these experiences, maybe when they come back, that's the new priority, right? And so we're trying to fit those in an earlier stage, whereas we may have felt like we had all the time in the world to do them before. I also think that it's really important to think through your community and what that's going to look like. We talk a lot about maintaining community. Communities naturally evolve over time, right? The people we're closest to in college, university are not the same people we're closest to after we have our first kid. And that as that evolves, because we're evolving, I think sometimes we get, when it ends abruptly, right, our community gets dislocated by virtue of our move or their move. We feel like we didn't have the opportunity to complete that. And I think there's ways to allow for it to be longer. So engaging with that person, whatever way makes the most sense for the both of you. Time zones are a challenge. I think for those people living in like 12-hour difference time zones, those are really, really difficult because the conversation you have in the morning is so different than the conversation you have in the evening. And I think that in those situations, you might have to say, okay, we actually need to schedule time so that we can both be here and present and available. And And then hopefully that also works better for people with the families and all of these other priorities that to create space where you can be dedicated and feel like it's a date, right? So maybe
Right.
you are both having coffee, or you are both watching something, or you're reading something. I used to do a virtual book club. You're reading something and you come together to discuss that. So it allows you to have some of those experiences while still being far. And over time, of course, by virtue of distance and relationships, that's going to change and evolve, and that'll change and evolve with the relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think, I suppose prior to this pandemic, I think a lot of us were finding time to connect quite challenging, actually, because life became very, very busy on a daily basis. And then you very quickly and sadly lose touch with many people. And, you'll be lucky. You're lucky if you have that kind of friend that when you do connect again, it's just like,
Right.
like old times, right? But I know a lot of relationships just slowly, disappear because of the time differences and that distance, and unable to be in each other's lives like you used to be.
Yeah. And that's when I think other things, right? So if you express yourself through writing or art or whatever, sharing that and telling people, hey, I'm thinking about you, that can be enough. I've reconnected with tons of people during this time that I also had lost touch with. And sometimes it's just a matter of being like, it's been a really long time. How are you doing? And this is such a wonderful moment for that reconnection and reflection because people do have more time. It's also a great time to, pursue all those things that you want to be doing,
Right.
but don't always create time and space for.
We don't have much excuse now. We have all the time.
But also, like, that might mean just taking care of yourself, it doesn't mean there's all these people who are like, what were you doing today? How were you productive? And it doesn't have to be that.
Not at all.
It can absolutely be about today I took care of myself by, giving myself a manicure. Whatever it is that works for you can be really instructive and critical to your self-care. And self-care is just so important for compassion and all of these things that we're talking about with respect to leaving and reuniting.
And I think it's something that people have learnt during this period as well. I mean, like for somebody that's always, a high achiever or always busy doing something with their day, to find themselves in a situation where, they've lost all of that momentum to a certain degree. It took me a little while because I'm somebody that doesn't like to stay home much. I'm always out, always find something to do, keep myself busy.
Yeah.
And I'd feel guilty just sitting on the couch watching TV. So, what you're saying is so right, is that it has given us back that kind of life that we miss, or we forgot about, that we deserve actually, to enjoy our quiet time, to enjoy just looking after ourselves, which is so important.
Yeah, it's there's this really interesting concept called time affluence. And I love this idea. It's this idea that, right. So if you look at sort of old paintings, Greek paintings, the most affluent people were the ones who had plenty of food, right? So they're a little bit what we would consider chubby today. And when you look at today and you see sort of this, everybody running towards, I'm not really sure what, but we're all just so busy. And are we busy with the things that we care the most about? And so how do we use our leisure time and that affluence of time, which we really have, given all of the technology that supports us run our households? How do we use that to align ourselves with the things we care about? And I think there's a great time where people are sort of realizing, maybe I've had this. I work full time and do Nextpat part time, and I was like, maybe what I care about is actually Nextpat more, and maybe I need to take some time off of work more often. And I think that realigning our values and knowing what that means to us makes us more joyful people, and that allows us to be more present even when we're farther apart.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you as well, Priya, do you also work with children on this? Or do you guide the parents on how to guide the children going through these kind of like forced evacuations, or just simply, the transition of moving from country to country?
Yeah. So on the normal transitions I do, when there is sort of like this evacuation situation, if there's greater trauma than a normal change, I will often refer them to some of the other folks that I work with because I don't work directly with children. Teens or higher, I'm usually more comfortable with what I have being more applicable. That being said, I moved back when I was 8 and really, really struggled. But I think some of that was just growing up, and I don't know what my parents could have done, but be there. Right now, we are in the middle of writing a workbook for college age students who've had to return home during the pandemic, and sort of how do all of the adults in this new relationship continue to coexist as a family, but as independent adults. And so what does a roommate agreement look like, and how do you reflect on that and have a conversation about it, as opposed to parents and children?
Very interesting. I'll actually be very interested to have that.
Yeah.
I have my daughter who's in uni, and she had to come back, and that was hard. That was really hard on her. And I can imagine for most university students, this should be the time of their life, really, with their friends and the dorms and just having fun, and that's just been taken away from them overnight, and they just don't know when it's going to come back again.
And it's just, from reflecting on it, the autonomy and independence you could still do some of that, right? Like you could still give them the independence to go out and find their community, but they can't go out.
No, they can't. That's the problem, right?
And it's just, it's so hampering for this really important developmental stage in our lives. So I'm doing that with a few other people who are better in the pedagogy stage than I am. Yeah. Okay. How has that been for you guys? Because she evacuated essentially, right? She left her dorm, came home.
Right. Exactly. So she wasn't far from us. She's in Abu Dhabi and we're in Dubai.
Okay.
But still she had that independence and basically control of her life, make her own decisions. No mum is telling her what time you're coming back at night and all that kind of stuff that comes with staying home, right?
Yeah.
But even coming home and having to stay home is a huge challenge. It's not like she can come home and go out like you just said.
Right.
She doesn't even have that. So that just takes, some adjustment. They have they reach a point where they have that need of independence and they want to be in control of their lives. And we are young adults now, and they always want to have that experience, and rightly so. And it's part of their growth and part of their journey. But to have that taken away from them overnight, literally, and just not knowing when and if and how and what's going to be different when they get back. It's really challenging. A lot of tears. I can tell you that there were a lot of tears. So
it's such an uncertain time for everybody. And I guess for those who are in that headspace, if they can be, it's so hard. This is life though, right? Like we've all dealt with these challenges, maybe not at this scale, but life is about these unexpected things that come up and the uncertainty and how you navigate that with grace and compassion.
Absolutely. So joining us just now is Miriam, and Miriam is somebody that's actually going to go through a move during the pandemic from Ghana to Portugal.
Wow.
And she's pregnant and she's got 2 kids.
Oh
and so I'm like, you should connect with Miriam, definitely, if you haven't already connected with her before. She's just got an amazing story. Someone that definitely has a wealth of experience in what we're talking about today.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and Mary is saying that she has to get back to work.
Yep.
Thank you, Mary, for joining us. Yes, thank you, sweetie.
So I'm not sure if we've got much more to say. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if anyone is going through something and wants to talk about it. Happy to discuss
so if you guys are not comfortable commenting below, you can always reach out to Priya anytime. She, obviously, I'll leave her details on top of this video once we're done. But anything to do with transition or forced evacuations, repatriation, anything that you're going through, Priya can help you and guide you and coach you to find yourself in a better place. And I think, very interestingly, the one that you have coming up for the teenagers and the young college students, I'll be very, very interested to know more about that. once it comes.
Yeah, no, I'll forward it along. We're still in the midst of creating it, but we know it's definitely a need out there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Priya, for your time.
Thank you,
And
Naveen, for inviting
sharing
me.
your expertise with us. Again, contact us with any questions, and hopefully to see you on here again.
Sounds great. Take good care.
Okay, bye.